There is something that nobody talks about when they look back at the 1970s in Britain. Not the power cuts, not the 3-day week, not the queues at the petrol stations. What nobody talks about is what was sitting quietly in the kitchen, humming, waiting, working. There were 5 names that any engineer, any repairman, any housewife worth her salt in Britain trusted completely. Not because of a television advert, not because of a glossy catalogue page, because those machines simply would not die. You plugged them in, you used them, and years later, sometimes decades later, they were still there, still doing exactly what they promised. This is not a story about nostalgia for its own sake. This is a story about a standard, a philosophy of making things that has almost entirely disappeared from British life. And once you understand what these 5 brands actually stood for, how they were built, who built them, and what destroyed them, you will never look at a cheap appliance the same way again. Because here is what nobody tells you about the 1970s British kitchen. It was, without exaggeration, one of the finest moments in the history of domestic engineering. Not because Britain had unlimited money, not because materials were cheaper, but because the people who designed these machines genuinely believed that if something broke within a few years, they had failed. That was the standard. Failure meant the thing broke. Success meant your grandchildren inherited it. Think about that for a moment. We are talking about a kettle on a wedding gift list, priced at around £7 when the average weekly wage was 14. People saved up for it. They chose it carefully, and they kept it for 20 years. Because it was worth keeping. We are talking about a food mixer that repairmen today in the 21st century, still describe as a tough old beast. Machines built in the early 1980s come into workshops after 40 years of use, get a clean and a service, and go straight back into the kitchen to make another 40 years worth of cakes. We are talking about an iron bought sometime in the 1940s that was still working well enough decades later to be crowned Britain's oldest working iron in a public competition, not a museum piece. A working iron. 5 brands, 5 different stories. One shared belief that the person buying your product deserved something that would last. So let's go back. Let's open the kitchen door in 1970 and walk inside. Because what you are about to hear is the real story of British engineering at its absolute peak and the almost criminal way it was dismantled. The first name on that list might surprise you. It started in America, but by the time the 1970s arrived, it had become the most British thing in your kitchen. Hot Point. The name alone should ring a bell. If you grew up in Britain in the 1960s or 70s, there is a very good chance that your mother's washing machine, your family's refrigerator carried that name, or the cooker in the corner of the kitchen carried that name on a small metal badge. Understated. Reliable. There. The origin of the name is quietly brilliant. It comes from an electric iron invented by an American engineer named Earl Richardson in 1905. The iron's hottest point was at the front tip, not the center, which made it far more precise for getting into collars and cuffs. He called it the hot point iron. He had no idea that decades later that name would become shorthand for domestic trust in a country 4,000 miles away. By the 1960s, Hot Point had become the undisputed market leader in household electrical appliances in the United Kingdom, ahead of everyone, ahead even of Sweden's Electrolux, which was no small competitor. That position wasn't handed to them. It was earned through machines that worked, and kept working, and when something did go wrong, could be repaired by a local engineer with a standard set of tools. But here is the detail that stops most people in their tracks. By 1972, the industrial group that had formed around Hot Point employed 10,700 people, 10,700 men and women, in British factories building British appliances. Their combined turnover was £50 million a year, and they had placed roughly 2 appliances in every single household across Britain. 2 per home. On average. That is how deeply embedded these brands were. This was not a niche market. This was the fabric of how Britain ran its homes. A washing machine in Swinton, a refrigerator in Peterborough, a cooker rolling off a line, in a factory where the workers knew the product by name, by part number, by the sound it made when the motor was running correctly. And then something happened. Something that had nothing to do with engineering, nothing to do with quality, nothing to do with whether the machines were good enough. In 1974, the British government introduced a second rate of VAT, value-added tax, specifically targeting what they classified as luxury goods. Electrical appliances were on that list. A washing machine was a luxury. A refrigerator was a luxury. The things that had become central to how millions lived, classified overnight as luxuries and taxed accordingly. Demand collapsed, not gradually, sharply. Hours were cut at the Swinton factory, the great Morphy Richards and Hotpoint production site, from late 1975. By spring of 1976, roughly half the workforce had lost their jobs. Half, because a politician decided a washing machine was a luxury. That decision didn't kill British appliance manufacturing on its own, but it opened a wound, and wounds, left untreated, have a way of becoming something far worse. But first, the second name on the list. And this one was born not in a boardroom, but in a converted oast house in Kent, in the summer of 1936. Donald Morphy was an engineer. Charles Richards was a salesman. They had met while working together at a company that made electric fires, and they had arrived at the same conclusion. Britain's homes were full of people who wanted better appliances, and nobody was making them affordable enough. On the 8th of July 1936, they registered their new company at an oast house in St. Mary Cray, Kent. They had raised £1,000. They were not wealthy men. They were practical men, and they set to work. The philosophy from day one was simple and almost radical for its time. Produce affordable, modern appliances for the mass market and back them with a genuine 2-year guarantee. Morphy Richards offered 2 years, not as a marketing trick, as a statement of confidence in what they were building. They started with electric fires, moved into irons in March of 1938. During the Second World War, their factories were redirected to produce components for the aircraft industry. When the war ended, they came back with the same energy. By 1949, Morphy Richards had introduced the United Kingdom's first automatic toaster, a machine that decided when your bread was done. In 1951, they were at the Ideal Home exhibition showing off a new iron that was nearly 2 pounds lighter than their original model from the 30s, without sacrificing an ounce of performance. By 1951, they were at the Ideal Home exhibition showing off a new iron that was nearly 2 pounds lighter than their original model, capable of 25 minutes of steam-assisted ironing in a single fill. These were not novelties. These were genuine engineering solutions. And then there is Chris West's iron. This is the detail that stays with you. A Morphy Richards senior iron purchased somewhere in the 1940s, passed down through a family, used as a housewarming gift in the 80s, and eventually entered into a competition to find Britain's oldest working iron. It won, not because it was in a glass case, because it still worked. An iron from the 1930s design era, still pressing shirts into the 21st century. That is not a coincidence. That is what the 2-year guarantee actually meant in practice. It meant they were not designing to a minimum standard. They were designing so that returning a product under guarantee would be an embarrassment, something that simply should not happen. By 1962, Morphy Richards was exporting to over 120 countries. 120. From an oast house in Kent. But now, and pay close attention here, because the next brand on this list has a beginning that almost nobody knows, and it begins with a falling out. Bill Russell and Peter Hobbs both worked at Morphy Richards. Russell was chief development engineer. Hobbs ran the South African division. In 1952, Bill Russell had a disagreement with Donald Morphy. Russell left, Hobbs joined him, and together they founded Russell Hobbs Limited. Russell on design and engineering, Hobbs on marketing and sales. 2 men, a clear division of skills, and an absolute refusal to make anything they were not proud of. Russell's approach to quality testing was extraordinary. His de facto ultimate safety test for any new product was to pour half a pint of boiling gravy on it. If it survived that, if it kept working, if the electrics stayed sealed, it went to market. If it didn't, it went back to the drawing board. In 1952, they introduced the world's first automatic coffee percolator, the CP1. A machine that made coffee and then kept it warm. It was the first of its kind on the planet. Not in Britain. On the planet. But 3 years later, they did something that would change British kitchens permanently. In October of 1955, Russell Hobbs introduced the K1, the world's first automatic electric kettle. Before the K1, you boiled a kettle by watching it. The K1 used a bimetallic strip. When the water boiled, steam was forced through. The strip activated, and the switch cut the power. The kettle turned itself off. It sounds simple now. At the time, it was genuinely revolutionary. By 1960, they had refined this into the K2, a stainless steel kettle, with a design so clean and so durable that it stayed in production for over 20 years. It appeared on wedding gift lists at a price of around £7. People chose it as a gift. They saved for it. They gave it to the people they loved at the moments that mattered most, and those people kept it for decades. By 1967, Russell Hobbs had sold 1 million appliances. By 1975, that number had reached 5 million, driven by kitchens where it just worked. If you are enjoying this look back, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, hit that bell so you never miss a video, and leave a comment below telling us which of these brands you remember in your home. Was it the Russell Hobbs kettle, the Morphy Richards iron? Right, back to Hoover. There are very few brands that have achieved what Hoover achieved, not market dominance. Plenty of brands have done that. Hoover became a verb. In Britain, you do not vacuum the carpet, you hoover it. The brand name so completely replaced the generic word that generations grew up not knowing vacuum was the term. That level of cultural embedding does not happen by accident. It happens because the product worked so consistently, for so many years, that the name became inseparable from the action. The pivotal moment for British manufacturing came on the 12th of October 1948, when Hoover opened its factory in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales. That factory became a cornerstone of Welsh industrial employment. It built washing machines. Real ones, twin-tub models that ran from 1948 to 93, 45 years of production from a single Welsh plant. The workers there did not just build appliances. They built a community around the work. Hoover expanded its range: washing machines, tumble dryers, vacuum cleaners. Their vacuum cleaners in particular were engineering achievements, built to be repairable. When something eventually goes wrong, a Hoover could be fixed. Parts were available. The machines were designed with the assumption that they would be repaired, not replaced. But here is the part of the Hoover story that almost nobody discusses. By 1974, the market had shifted. Price competition was intensifying. Cheaper alternatives were arriving. Hoover, committed to building things properly, found that commitment increasingly difficult to sustain at a price point that the market would accept. Profits had dropped. By 1977, Hoover made a decision. They withdrew from competing in the broader domestic appliance market entirely and refocused back on their core product. It was a rational business decision. It was also, in a quieter sense, a retreat. A signal that the world in which you could build quality appliances and compete had begun to narrow. But before we get to what happened next, and what happened next should make you angry, we need to talk about the fifth name, Kenwood. Built by Kenneth Wood. Kenneth Wood had a straightforward belief. Luxury items should quickly become necessities. Things people thought they couldn't afford should become things they couldn't live without. He began trading in 1947 with a toaster, the AO100, and a basic food mixer. Neither was especially remarkable, but they were the beginning. In 1950, at the Ideal Home Exhibition, Kenwood launched the Chef. It was not just a mixer, it was a machine with attachments: whisk, beat, mince, slice, juice. It sold for £19 and 10 shillings, and it sold immediately, because it did things that no single machine had done before. It made the kitchen worth equipping properly. In 1958, Wood decided the design needed refreshing. Kenneth Grange built only half the model and stood a mirror against it to show the full form. Wood loved it. By 1960, the redesigned Chef, the A701, was rolling out of the factory in Woking. That design barely changed for the next 60 years. Grange had got it right. He later said, "Slightly heavier says longer life, better value." He deliberately chose materials that were heavier because weight communicated solidity and permanence. By the mid-1970s, the A901 series had arrived, a refinement of the A701 with a slightly more streamlined appearance and improved electronic speed control. The attachments available by 1976 were extraordinary in their range. Mincers, slicers, a coffee mill, a sausage-making attachment, a bean slicer, a pea huller, one motor. Repairmen who work on these machines today describe the A901 in the same terms. Major components rarely fail. A 40-year-old machine gets a clean and a re-grease and goes back into service. That is a design philosophy made physical. A decision that the machine should be fixable, that repair should be possible, that the person owning it should be able to keep it. Kenneth Grange was knighted in 2013. His work included the Intercity 125 train and the London taxi. But most remember the thing on their kitchen worktop. But now we need to talk about what happened to all of it. Because the story of these 5 brands does not end with awards and warm kitchens. It ends somewhere far colder. By the early 1980s, something had shifted irreversibly in British manufacturing. The signals had been there: the VAT shock, the workforce cuts, the slow withdrawal of brands. In the 80s and 90s, what had been a gradual erosion became something much faster, much more final. The factories began to close. Morphy Richards was one of them. The Mexborough factory in South Yorkshire, the heart of their production for decades, announced in June of 2000 that 120 staff were being let go. Imports took over. 3 years later, the Bangor factory in County Down closed entirely. Manufacturing transferred to the Far East. The machines that had lasted 40 years outlived the factories that built them. Read that again. The appliances were still working. The buildings that made them were dark and empty. Kenwood followed. Made in China now, lighter, quieter, less durable, the name remained. The philosophy did not make the journey. These companies were outcompeted on price by manufacturers with lower costs and no commitment to engineering standards. The British consumer often chose the £30 option, not because they didn't value quality, because quality had become a luxury, and the government had already said appliances were luxuries. There is a straight line between that VAT decision and an empty factory in the year 2000. It is not a comfortable line to draw, but it is there. What was lost was a set of values, the belief that an iron should last long enough to be handed down. The belief stated by Kenneth Grange that repair was commonplace, that you would never think of not repairing something. That belief disappeared from the economics. What remains now are the machines themselves. Description of the old machines still used every week. They are still there, still working, still right. So here is what you are left with. 5 brands, 5 founded stories. One shared conviction that ran through all of them like a thread of steel. The person deserved something real, not something adequate, something real. Engineers understood that cutting corners was not efficiency, it was dishonesty. That is the standard that was set in Britain in the 1970s. Most of what fills our kitchens today will not make it to the next decade. It was designed to a price point. Replacement is the business model, the cycle is the product. Those 5 brands were built on the opposite idea. And for a few extraordinary decades, that idea won. It gave British workers something to build they could point to with genuine pride. If you still have one of those old machines, a Kenwood chef in the garage, a Russell Hobbs kettle in a cupboard, do not throw it away. Have it looked at, have it serviced. It was built to last. And if this video brought back a memory, leave that memory in the comments below. We want to hear it. Those stories matter. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this. Built to last.